What is your most this is not happening moment? I was getting ready to jump in the shower to go work for a few hours when I heard a knock on the door. I had a pair of gym shorts on, so I went and answered it. And to my amazement, there were a bunch of cops outside. They told me they had had a complaint of loud noise and possibly domestic violence. I just laughed and said, no, that's not here as I live alone. And they said, well, that's okay. One of them asked me if I had any ID on me so they could go about their business, and I said, sure. My wallet was on the wall right by the door, and so I pulled my ID out and handed it to one of the officers. He looked at it and asked me if I could step outside again. I kind of chuckled and said, yeah, no problem. As soon as I stepped out of the door of my house, the other officer said, turn around, put your hands behind your back. I looked at him kind of funny, and I said, what for? He said, turn around. So I turned around. I put my hands behind my back. Suddenly I felt handcuffs. As they set me down in front of the house on my bench, I asked one of the other officers what this was all about. He said, there's a warrant out for your arrest. Now, mind you, I have never been in any kind of trouble at all in my life. And so again, I kind of chuckled. I said, what kind of warrant? The officer said, I don't know, it's from out of state. Now I'm starting to get a little freaked out. So the officer leads me into the car. All I have is my gym shorts and flip-flops and my cell phone. That, of course, was taken from me. As we're driving to the jail about 45 minutes later, I asked the officer what this is all about. He said, I really don't know. It's an out-of-state warrant, and we got to take you to jail. And it looks like there's a no bond clause on this warrant, which means until I figure out what this is, I'm stuck there. I was put into a holding cell with about 15 gangbangers in Fort Lauderdale, Broward County Jail. About 11 that night was transferred to a holding jail, given a 2-inch mattress and a blanket, and told to go to sleep on the floor. At this point, I've asked probably 4 or 5 officers what's going on and nobody seems to know. I haven't seen an attorney and I don't have any telephone numbers memorized. Stupid smartphone, so the next day, I ask an officer again what's going on and how do I find out? He comes back and simply says it's an out-of-state warrant. You'll have to wait to see the judge. I said I want to access my cell phone so I can find some numbers and call somebody. At that point, they told me they won't let me unless there's a court order. Here's where it gets really bad. As if it wasn't bad enough already, I don't see a judge for 8 days. Yep, you read that right. I'm 8 days in jail, not having any idea why, not seeing an attorney, and having no access to call anyone. I finally see a judge on the 8th day, and he tells me it's an out-of-state warrant, and again, he doesn't know what it's for. And I have a choice. I can fight extradition, or I can concede to extradition. If I fight, I'm going to probably be there for 60 days minimum and possibly be let out. If I concede, I could be there another 45 days before they take me to the other state. So I conceded, and I asked him for the court order to access my phone. The judge says he's never heard of having to have a court order to access a cell phone, but reluctantly gives one. On the 9th day, as I asked to again access my phone, I'm told that they're not going to allow me to access my phone even though they have a court order because the phone battery is dead now. I don't know what to do. This is the 9th day, and it turns into the 10th and 11th and 12th, etc. On the 23rd day, no one in the world knows where I am. I'm assuming my kids probably think I'm dead as they live in another state. North Carolina shows up to extradite me on the 23rd day during this 48-hour trip where I'm shackled hand and foot in the back of a van. I finally convinced one of the officers that is driving to access their Facebook account and message a friend of mine to try to get a phone number. They do that, and of course my friend thinks it's a scam. Finally, I gave him information that only I would know, and I get a phone number. On the 25th day in North Carolina, I finally found out what the charge is. Former client of mine from 4 years prior in a business that I had and signed over to another partner have accused me of taking $20,000 and fleeing the state. I laughed again, but not real hard this time because this was getting real. As I'm booked into their jail, I'm trying to figure out what to do. The next day, I finally saw an attorney. He doesn't have too much information for me, but tells me what the charge entails and what the possibilities are for sentencing and things like that. A few days later, he comes back with what they call discovery, which is evidence on me from the district attorney's side. As we went through that, I found no evidence at all pointing any kind of criminal activity to me, which of course I knew because I hadn't done anything. However, the initial relief quickly turned into a burning anger. How was it possible that I was in this situation? Days in jail, treated like a criminal, while the only evidence against me was a baseless accusation built on either a misunderstanding or, worse, a blatant lie. I returned to my cell, the feeling of injustice boiling in my chest. Every minute I spent, there was a cruel reminder of how my life had been turned upside down. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. The prison food was horrible, but what really bothered me was the sense of powerlessness. I was stuck in a system that seemed completely indifferent to the truth. My court-appointed lawyer? Useless. He kept telling me to be patient and let the process run its course. How could I be patient? My life was being destroyed while I sat in a cell, waiting for answers that never came. Weeks passed, and my desperation started morphing into anger. Anger at the police for arresting me without investigating. Anger at the judicial system for treating me like a case number. And most of all, anger at the person who put me in this situation. That former client, with her absurd accusation, was out living her life while I rotted in a cell. I couldn't comprehend how someone could be so malicious. One day, during one of the rare visits from the lawyer, he said something that pushed my frustration over the edge. "They're considering offering you a plea deal," he said, as though it was a solution. "If you plead guilty, you could serve just a few months instead of risking trial and a longer sentence." I stared at him in disbelief for a moment. "You want me to plead guilty to something I didn't do?" I asked, my voice shaking with outrage. He shrugged. "Sometimes it's easier that way. That's my advice." I exploded. "Easier for who? For you? For them? I didn't do anything. And you want me to say I'm guilty just to make things easier? No, I won't admit to something I didn't do." He just shook his head, as though I was naive. That was the moment I realized I was on my own. If I wanted to get out of this, I'd have to fight for myself. But fighting seemed impossible. They'd confiscated my phone and still refused to let me access it, using the ridiculous excuse that the battery was dead. I didn't have phone numbers memorized, so I couldn't call friends or family. My kids, living in another state, were probably terrified, thinking I had disappeared. It was as though I'd been erased from the world. One day, a fellow inmate approached me in the cell. He had overheard my story and seemed genuinely shocked. "You don't belong here, man," he said. "But let me tell you something. Nobody's going to fight for you. If you want out, you've got to make noise. Yell, scream. Make them hear you." His words stuck with me. I wasn't the kind of person to make a scene, but I realized staying quiet was only making things worse. At my next hearing, I decided I wasn't going to be ignored. When the judge entered and asked if I had anything to say, I stood up and let it all out. I told them about the days spent in a cell with no answers, the incompetence of the system, and how I was being accused with no real evidence. I talked about my kids who probably thought I was dead. The judge tried to interrupt me, but I kept going. If they wanted me to stop, they'd have to drag me out of there. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse, but I felt like I'd finally done something. To my surprise, it seemed to have an impact. The judge ordered my lawyer to review the evidence again and demanded additional documentation from the prosecutor. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone was at least pretending to care. A few days later, my lawyer returned with new information. The supposed money transfer that I was accused of authorizing, it had been made months after I had transferred my ownership of the business to my former partner. My name was still on some paperwork, but bank records clearly showed I had no access to the accounts at the time. It was proof that I was being wrongfully accused. When this was presented in court, the prosecutor tried to downplay it. It could have been an administrative error, they said, as if that justified the hell I had been through. I almost laughed. An administrative error? I had spent over a month in jail because of an administrative error? Finally, the judge ruled that the charges against me were unfounded and ordered my release. But the anger inside me didn't dissipate. Yes, I was free, but what about the time I lost? What about the damage to my reputation? And my kids, who had spent weeks not knowing where I was? I walked out of that prison determined not to let this go. I hired a lawyer to sue the state for wrongful imprisonment and started legal action against my former partner for forgery and defamation. Today, months later, I still carry the scars of that nightmare. I lost weeks of my life, opportunities at work, and friends who believed the lies. But I also gained something: the resolve to never stay silent in the face of injustice again. That experience changed me forever, and now I fight, not just for myself, but for anyone who's ever been a victim of the same broken system. Finally, when the judge announced that I was free and the charges against me had been dismissed, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. But the relief lasted only a moment. Anger quickly replaced it. I had lost over a month of my life because of a false accusation and a completely negligent judicial system. My reputation was in shambles. My kids had gone weeks without knowing where I was, and the trauma of the experience still burned in every part of me. It was clear that simply walking away and trying to move on wouldn't be enough. Someone had to pay for this. I decided right then and there that I wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As soon as I walked out of that jail, I hired the best attorney I could find. He listened to my story intently, taking down every detail. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "You've got a solid case, a very solid case. We're going after the state for wrongful imprisonment and, of course, your former client for defamation. First, we went after the state. My lawyer built a robust case, highlighting every mistake made from the moment of my arrest. The police had detained me without properly investigating, acting on a flimsy, poorly substantiated warrant. The prosecution ignored obvious evidence that could have immediately proven my innocence. And, worst of all, I was kept in a cell for weeks without access to my phone, without communication with the outside world, and without any clear explanation for my arrest. During the trial against the state, my lawyer didn't hold back. He described in vivid detail the devastating impact this ordeal had on my life. My client was treated like a dangerous criminal, handcuffed and thrown into an overcrowded cell without even knowing why he was arrested, he told the court. All of this based on a poorly investigated warrant and an unfounded accusation. The state failed to protect an innocent citizen. It failed in an unforgivable way. On the other side, the state's representatives tried to justify their actions. They claimed they were simply following protocol and that mistakes can happen. That last phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. Mistakes can happen? Sure, but who was going to pay for their mistake? Who was going to give me back the time I lost? Who was going to compensate me for the trauma I endured? The court didn't seem very receptive to their justifications. After weeks of hearings, the judge delivered the verdict. The state was ordered to pay me a multi-million-dollar settlement for wrongful imprisonment and emotional distress. But I wasn't done yet. The next step was suing my former client. This was an even more personal battle. She had lied, twisted facts, and dragged me into this nightmare for no reason. During the trial, it became clear that she had acted out of pure malice or, at the very least, gross negligence. My lawyer tore apart her claims, proving that the money transfer she accused me of authorizing had actually been approved by my former business partner, the real culprit. When confronted in court, she tried to deflect, blaming others and saying she just wanted justice. Justice? I almost laughed when I heard that. Where was the justice when she decided to ruin my life with a false accusation? In the end, the judge ruled in my favor, not only clearing my name, but also ordering her to pay me a significant sum for defamation and damage to my reputation. It was a bittersweet moment. Yes, I had won, but nothing could truly make up for what I had lost. However, knowing that she would face the consequences of her actions brought me a sense of closure. With both victories in court, I began rebuilding my life. I used the settlement money to stabilize my finances and recover the lost time with my kids. I made sure to explain everything to them, ensuring they understood that I would never abandon them and that what happened was an injustice I had fought to correct. They were relieved, but like me, they carried the scars of the ordeal. It wasn't easy for us, but we came out stronger. Today, as I look back, I see this story as a powerful reminder of how systems can fail and how people can be cruel. But I also see it as a lesson in perseverance. I could have accepted the injustice and moved on, but I chose to fight, not just for myself, but to set an example that this kind of mistreatment cannot go unchecked. The settlement money was more than fair, not just for what I went through, but for what it represented: accountability. The state and my former client were forced to answer for their actions, and that is something I carry with pride. My life may never be exactly as it was before, but now I know I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Above all, I've learned that we should never stay silent when justice fails us.